Welcome again. We are in 10 Parables, number 5, chapter 5, The Weathered Tree. And tonight, leading the discussion is Annette. I'm just going to move my computer over here and take it away, love.
Okay, so I figured we would I'm going to start reading it. I'll get a few paragraphs in, and then I'd like to ask some questions and start a discussion. So I'm just going to start from the beginning. In the Sawtooth Mountains of Idaho, there is a wind-swept granite rock outcropping overlooking a beautiful valley. A solitary ponderosa pine tree grows in a crack of this cliff. Below her, in contrast, there is a valley forest. The tree lives in the most difficult spot of all the forest. To look at it, it appears there is too little soil for the tree to have begun life there. Once life began, it looks as if there would be too little water to sustain it. And even if its life were possible, the wind never stops blowing at the place, pushing the tree in one direction, then another, never stopping. The tree has been buffeted and blown relentlessly throughout her difficult life. A forest grew in the sheltered valley below this granite cliff. In the forest, there is rich and fertile ground for trees, which stores water from the snows of winter and the rain of spring. Trees are sheltered by the valley and by each other from any wind which blows. The forest trees grew straight, tall, and in perfect symmetry. The tree on the cliff, however, is weathered and beaten. It could not grow straight, but was twisted by the buffeting of the wind as it grew. The weathered tree spiraled as she grew upward, unlike the straight trees below. Once she was struck by lightning, which charred a side of her and tore her original upward-reaching arms. Though she suffered injuries which would kill most trees, she miraculously returned to life, bearing a dark scar from the lightning on her side and injuries to her reaching arms. Okay, so my first question, going through this first part, I noticed the 4 elements that were included. There was too little soil that it should have survived. So there was a lack of earth. There was too little water. There was a lack of water. There was too much wind. And then with the lightning, there was fire. And so I wanted to see what you guys thought of the inclusion of those 4 elements in the growing up of the tree. Just chill on here. She's not.
Jill, are you out there? Yeah, I think she's listed as
I
West.
am. It takes me longer to get on here. Sorry. I couldn't get my Bluetooth headphones to work. Yeah, I love that you included that question, because I had noticed that when I was reading it this go round. But the thing that really stood out to me is when you said that all of these elements were included in the growing up of this tree, because the way that I see the lightning strike is the baptism of fire. In my experience, and in Hinduism, what they call the Kundalini Awakening, it really is like a bolt of electricity that comes in the top part of your crown and goes all the way through your body. It just zips like a thunderbolt, a lightning bolt that goes all the way down into your feet. And it's so wild to see that she bared that scar, the burnt scar from that. Now, when I think about the baptism of fire, I think about broken heart, right? And that she had to have gotten through this life that she had, being just blown by that wind. All of those elements all came together to lead to this beautiful / very painful and traumatic experience of the broken heart and the contrite spirit. But that it was a necessary part of her experience, I believe. It's why she was so wise in the end, because she had learned all of this experience throughout her lifetime. So I really like that you pointed that out.
When I was reading through this, it struck me that the first line of that paragraph, so the second paragraph, the tree lives in the most difficult spot of all the forest. And the difficulty is associated with the elements. Because of the spot, there's a problem with earth. Because of the spot, there's a problem with lightning, the fire, there's no water, and the wind. All of those are difficult because of the place where the tree is. And all of the other trees probably are also having difficulties, but they're fighting one another in order to partake of or benefit from their place or positioning. This particular tree, though, doesn't have the fight with any other trees, but is essentially fighting Mother Nature, fighting Earth, or I don't want to say fighting God, but fighting against the command of God, the elements.
So, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think that it's significant that the trees don't get to choose where they get planted. That's just something that happens. And I think that this isn't something they brought upon themselves. This is the condition or the location in which they find themselves. And so there's an agency component, I guess, in how they respond to their environment, but not the environment that they're in.
Yeah, very true. Did anyone else have other thoughts on the elements?
This is Jacqueline. I actually do.
Please.
I've been noticing as we've been studying this that these parables actually transition from one to another. And I think the symbolism of the four corners of the earth and her being the center pole or the center point that's raised up high above the people, it is a covenantal language along with the imagery of temple symbolism. So she, in my mind, depicts the Holy of Holies, who is the high center point. And what's interesting is if you start looking at, there's a lot of names that Jerusalem has been called throughout the eons of time. But one of them is one of the first ones back in Abraham's day, and it was called the dwelling place of the I can't read my own writing. Basically, the dwelling place of Shalom, or Shiloh, and the city of peace. And also what I find interesting is it's also called the city of Ariel, which means the hearth of God, or we think of that being the holy place. The hearth of God would be the altar inside the holy place, she emerging out of that altar as a holy being. So those are some thoughts that I had about how that transitioned into this one.
Yeah, like that.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think too, thinking about like the nourishment, like it reminds me of like almond, the seed, right? How the seed needs to be nourished in order to grow. But obviously by conventional standards, like this tree didn't get like what we would consider enough air, enough water, enough soil, yet it still survived. It still was nourished, right? And it reminds me of, I was just reading in the testimony of St. John. It's the part where Christ is talking to the woman at the well, and she leaves to go tell everybody to come back and listen to him. And the disciples had come up with food. And when Christ saw that the crowd was coming, he told them that he wasn't going to eat. And they asked him, why not? And he told them that his nourishment didn't come from food, that his nourishment came from God, that he was nourished and could be sustained by God's will and by God's power, not by this earthly sustenance. So it kind of reminded me of that. Like the trees, by all accounts, should be dead, but is sustained by something.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's we can rely on all of the earthly and mortal nourishment that we want, but the thing that ultimately makes us the strongest and helps us to thrive is, the Lord sustaining us through our difficulties, and the difficulties are necessarily part of that and the things that make us strongest.
Annette?
Yep.
Can I add something? Oh, sorry.
As I read through this, it occurred to me that these natural stresses were forming this tree, not unlike the experiences of Axis, the great stallion. We all came from a place of light and intelligence and beauty, and we just get beat up in every conceivable way here. So these elements are the way that mortality forms us, the way that it tests us and hones us into becoming more like our Lord, who went through all of this before we did.
Yeah, absolutely. That was kind of one of my other questions later on. Was I was awfully reminded of Axis with this tree wasn't pretty, and it wasn't symmetrical. It didn't grow straight, and she had a big old scar down her side. All of the scars and the evidence of struggle and living that you see in Axis are reflected here with the tree. Adrian, did you have a comment?
Yeah, with regard to the lightning strike, not only did it wound her hands and her side, and of course it would have wounded her feet too because of the roots, but it would have killed most trees, and yet she miraculously returned to life. So in the symbolism of Heavenly Mother, this is one who has attained to the resurrection. And the particular placement of the wounds that are mentioned is specifically designed to draw our minds to Christ, who also attained to the resurrection of the dead, that we're dealing with a symbolism of a being who has ascended to that point. So Heavenly Mother kind of thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. I had underlined that too. She miraculously returned to life, and that reflects.
Tasha had something too. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Going along with the Heavenly Mother motif, and kind of what Kevin and Jacqueline both mentioned about these elements and how they are hard on us and form us into who we are. This gnarled and twisted and shorter tree that wasn't so pleasant to look on. Just as we're thinking about women, I know that one of the trials that women go through in life is childbearing and birth and pregnancy, and how difficult a thing that is, how we don't feel very pretty to be looked upon, and then the pains of labor. And that is part of a woman's progression through the eons. What makes her feminine, it's one of her roles is to carry and then bear children. So that seems to me as part of the scarring that may have gone on through eons of time, if we're likening this to the mother.
Yeah, absolutely. So I also wanted to ask, after the description of the weather tree, I put the question up on Covenant Chat. How do you see yourself in the weathered tree? How is that a reflection of you specifically?
I think the one thing that really stood out to me, this idea of her original upward reaching arms, it reminded me of that hymn where it says, he reaches our reaching, and so the way I relate is I'm always reaching for him, as in sometimes a flailing kind of way, in some weak, broken kind of way. We're reaching for the divine, and then he reaches our reaching. And so those upward reaching arms, it's just that imagery is really powerful to me.
Yeah, I like that. Anybody else?
I'll talk again.
You have to hold it down.
Oh, sorry.
No, you were good. We hear you.
I was unmuted.
Oh, you unmute? I'm sorry.
Yeah. The Sawtooth Mountains. This is where this weathered tree took root, and that's where I took root. I spent my summers growing up in the Sawtooth Mountains as an Idaho native. So this parable has always had a lot of meaning to me. And every time we go to the Sawtooths now as a family, every summer we look at all the trees on these granite outcroppings. Oh, there's the weathered tree. There she is. And it's just kind of a fun thing. So there's that. And then I guess the other thing would be the difficult life, the suffering that this tree went through. It's with a lifetime of pretty traumatic health issues. I understand suffering in a very deep and personal way. So
I had a comment. So this is one of two parables that have an actual physical location, Sawtooth Mountains and the greatest citizen in Brackhill, although Brackhill's not an actual place. Western Wyoming is, which is specifically listed. The other 8 are fictitious places. Anyway, we've listed now maybe 5 things that kind of draw us to Christ: the uplifting arms, the wound on the side, no comeliness that we should. I can't remember the scripture. No beauty that we should adore him or something.
Desire him.
Desire him. Thank you. There's a couple of others that haven't been listed. This tree grew in the poorest spot of ground. That's Jacob 5 language, Jacob 3 language. And then, of course, the tree becomes a savior and a mother, a father, mother in heaven to a new forest. So all those things point us to God and godliness and Christ, and yet it's a feminine.
Yeah.
I think those are all the Christ symbols.
You know, McKay, in addition to that, if you go to page 39, there's more to that. It's the solitary tree that is up above, hung for those to look and see and to mock, like Christ was on the cross. And I think that also points to a Christ role. But another thing that points to it being Christ's mate versus the mother is actually the scarring and the black on her side and on her hands, which goes to the Black Madonna, which is the hidden symbolism of his bride.
Very good. All right, I'm going to go ahead and continue at the bottom of 38. Year after year, the trees all grew. In the valley, trees reached heights over 300 feet, while the weather tree fought for more root space in the granite in which she was planted. Her height was stunted as her energy was spent in the struggle for root space and her lack of available water. She was twisted, so that her height was further limited by the turns her difficult life had taken. The forest trees below mocked the weather tree. They lived in companionship with each other, strong and straight. The solitary tree above had her shameful, twisted body on display for all the other trees to see and mock. It was right to have that tortured tree kept apart from the rest, they said, for she would never fit in with our beautiful forest below. That observation from the straight trees was so interesting to me, because they think it was right that she should have been set apart because she was ugly, and yet the fact that she was set apart was the cause of her ugliness. If she had been among them, she would have grown up straight and tall just like the rest, because she would have put in the same circumstances as them. And yet they, because of their limited experience and limited understanding, they don't see that. It's interesting to see the contrast between the forest and their thoughts and what they value, and the weather tree. The forest is very sheltered, and it was interesting seeing myself in this, where I grew up very sheltered, not just by the church and not just by my parents, but I was very good at sheltering myself. I didn't want to know any of the bad things. I didn't want to hear any of the swear words. I didn't want to listen to any of the rude stories from all the people in high school. I was so afraid of being tainted that I constantly sheltered myself from everything, which really didn't do me any favors and didn't give me further understanding and didn't make me any stronger. And then the contrast of that to when I walked away and left the church and had to let go of all those things and was suddenly off on my own, floundering to get my own root space and figure out what I believed. It's the contrast of that is very, very real, I think, for a lot of us.
So when you met Cameron, was it a shock or a delight?
It was shockingly delightful.
He was totes delightful. Okay. The years came and went, and while the weather tree continued her difficult existence, the forest enjoyed their pleasantries. Deer and elk lived in the forest. Ferns grew in its moist shade. There was harmony in the forest, which went beyond the trees alone. The forest was proud. Beside the weather tree, nothing grew. Even the granite outcropping was bare of moss or lichen. No deer ever came up to enjoy her shade. Her place was so harsh, not even wasps came to build a nest on her branches. She was solitary and rejected. Another symbol of Christ, of course. The forests of the Sawtooth Mountains are harvested by more than one lumber company. The time came when this part of the forest was set for the harvest. Men came and cut all the tall, straight trees below and took them away. However, the twisted weathered tree was not touched. She was in too precarious a place for the men to climb. Her trunk was too dangerous to cut because she would not fall straight. Okay, I want to pause there and read parts of a story that Denver told. And during a camp out a couple years ago.
So a little bit more background. This was
In the Sawtooths.
in the Sawtooths, the eclipse in the path of totality. A group gathered to observe there, and afterwards that evening we were sitting chatting about things, and Denver shared this story. It's recorded and it's available on Restoration Archive. So if anybody isn't familiar with it, you can go look for it there. But that's where this is coming from now.
And I would add, he shared this after we read this parable out loud to the whole group. Then he stood up and spoke.
Yeah, this was his bedtime story about the trees. I worked for the lumber company. I cut down trees. When you cut down a tree, the tree wants to fall in a very specific place. And when you walk up to it with a chainsaw, you have to stand at the bottom and look at it. If a tree is perfectly symmetrical and perfectly straight, you can make it fall anywhere you want it to. If there's more branches on one side than another, it will only fall that way. If it's leaning in one direction, it doesn't matter what the branches are doing, it's only going to fall that way. I'd walked up to a tree that literally, it didn't matter how long I looked at it, it was like the corkscrew tree in the parable. There was no way to figure out where this thing was going to fall. And I thought, maybe I'll leave this for someone else because I'm kind of afraid. This was a very big tree. It was going to kill someone, and I just assumed it wasn't me. I would just assume it wasn't me. But when I turned to leave it, the foreman yelled, "Get on with it." So I got on with it, and I cut out a wedge. It doesn't go well. The tree twisted. It made a horrible splintering sound, exactly what you don't want a tree to do, and then it fell. I still own the orange hat I wore that day. The base of the tree, which was bigger around than about two of those, flew back right at my head and hit the bill of that hard hat and sent it flying up the hill. I managed to duck and leave my head intact, but my hard hat is now about halfway between me and the owner of the company and my foreman. Okay, so for those hearing that, I'm curious about anyone's thoughts about that story and how it relates to the tree. Because one of the things in the parable later on, it talks about how her height, from her height, she could see farther than any of them below, which reminded me of prophets. You know, we kind of trust the messengers from the Lord to be able to see a little bit farther than we can to give us a heads up of what's happening. And then we have Denver telling this story, and he looks at it and he doesn't want to deal with it. Maybe I'll leave this for someone else because I'm kind of afraid. And I honestly wonder if that was his response when the Lord, a couple times when the Lord has asked him to do things. Because that would probably be my response. I'd be like, you want me to do that? Maybe I'll leave that for someone else because that doesn't sound too pleasant. So, anyone else's thoughts on that?
I have something. I find so much symbolism in this parable that it's almost hard to talk about because there's so much here. It's interesting the way he describes the forest being straight and everything is uniform and everything follows the same patterns. And when they fall into each other and knock the uniqueness off of one another. And anything that would make a tree unique, it's the branches, it's the way they grow, it's the directions they grow. They're all different for every single tree. And yet those trees were all unique and those branches were cut off. And to be down below and to be the one cutting the trees, you are left wondering which direction. You're left without direction is almost what I hear him saying. He didn't want to touch it. I mean, there's different ways you can go with this. If you're talking about the weathered tree, you don't want to, she's untouchable. She's not reachable. She's not anything that's approachable because she has endured so much. She has I don't know, where she is, she can't be reached. One would have to experience the similar circumstances to grow like she did. The trees in the forest were easily cut because they hadn't weathered any storms and they were don't do that. And they were didn't have the buffetings that would have caused them to be unique. And so it's interesting that and I don't remember if Denver said the tree that he was cutting was straight or if the tree that he was cutting was twisted.
It was twisted.
It was twisted.
Like the corkscrew tree from the parable. I have a really hard time saying that.
Okay.
So yeah, it was twisted. He didn't know where it was going to fall.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was straight, and it would just leave the. They have nowhere to go. They have no direction, and it's just haphazard. Whatever happens to them, was the thought that I had, but I could be very, very wrong.
Annette, I wonder, this is Jacqueline, if it wasn't a parable to let us know that he indeed has battled the great whore of the earth, and she struck out at his head, and luckily he was protected, but that was his hermetic way of letting us know that that's someone that he's had gone up against.
Yeah. Well, and going along with, if we compare that tree to the whore of the earth and corrupt religion and all that, it even talks about how when he cut into it, he hadn't realized that there was a bunch of termite damage too. And so the inside was actually rotted away, which caused even more problems than splintering. So that could very well be, something that could be said about the tree that he had cut down there. It could symbolize the corrupt religion that he's attempting to take down, and in return it tries to take him out as well.
So a couple of thoughts on the falling of the tree. When the Pharisees cut down the Savior, they expected him to fall to the ground, but he bounced back. And that's the way it is with the deity. Their ways are unpredictable because they're higher than our ways. There's nothing more predictable than a devil you know exactly what they're going to do. There's no independent thought, no light, even when there's a lot of knowledge. There's nothing that really surprises you about the wicked. But God, if he has any characteristic, it's you can't guess his ways. You can't guess which way he's going to fall or whether he'll stay down once you cut him down.
That's really interesting. I like that. Yeah. Let's see.
I had one thing to add. Although we haven't, actually, I probably could wait until we get there. Are you going to read through some more of it, Annette?
Yep.
I'll wait.
Okay. All right. So continuing on, a man could be injured or die trying to cut down such a tree. The tree wasn't straight enough to send to the lumber mill. Nothing could be made using her wood, for her shape was too distorted for any of the purposes men use such trees. As they cut the trees below, the forest was so dense, as one tree fell, it would strike against another, and break away the branches of both. I thought that was a very interesting detail for him to include. Seeing myself in the tall, straight trees, I can imagine that all of us in our ignorance, when we fall from our pride, it's not just ourselves that we take down. We tend to take down others with us. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's not just us that it affects. Once on the ground, the men would quickly trim all remaining branches from the trunk. Then the trunk would be drug away, loaded, and removed from the forest. The shock and dismay of the trees as they fell was shared by the weathered tree above. She looked down in wonder at this sudden end to all the pride, all the beauty, and all the life which had lived for so long below her. Okay, I want to know what you guys think the sudden end of all pride refers to. When the trees fell, there was a sudden end to all pride.
The scripture that comes to mind is that the wicked will be burned as stubble. The pride will be destroyed at the Savior's return. There's the destruction of the wicked is the end of the world. So that's kind of what it reminds me of. I also thought it's interesting that there's more than one lumber company. There's more than one way to take a tumble if you're a prideful tree.
I'd add too, if you think about the parable or the vision of the train that Denver shared at a conference, and then they hid in the cavity of the rock, and this overwhelming flood of fire came and kind of clear cut the world, burned everything to stubble, and then new life grew out of the ruins of that, which is what happens in this parable as well. If you look at the last several parables, we had the first couple which had certain direction they were going and introductory and things like that, and then you have triangularity, which is about faith. You have the horses of Shiloh, which actually is deeply about repentance, and then you have this, which is about baptism. There's a baptism of fire, there's a newness of life, the trees are all clear cut, and new trees spring forth in a newness of life that this time respect their mother. It's almost as if we're walking through these gospel principles.
Yeah, with the baptism and everything, I was reminded of Noah. The sudden end to all pride, harkens back to the flood, where clean the slate and start anew.
I also would like to add that the scripture about the great and abominable church, and great was the fall thereof, comes to mind, because all these tall, straight trees, very pharisaical, very, very, very judgmental, yeah, very, very, very proud and haughty, and one day that will fall.
Yeah.
This language sounds just like Isaiah. The Lord shall come upon all the cedars of Lebanon, for they are high and lifted up, and upon all the oaks of Bashan. There's more to that language, but it's Isaiah language.
Yeah.
And that's something that stood out to me about backing up just a little bit when you were talking about cutting, at the time of the harvest, when the men are coming in to cut down the trees, you can kind of liken it to the harvest, right? And that the wicked will be destroying the wicked. When the one tree falls, its branches are destroyed as well as the other branches, right? So it's like sheer pandemonium during that process. And so that's what, I guess that's one of my thoughts just right now, is that they were destroying themselves on the way down, right? So then that's where that end of pride comes from, because they've destroyed themselves. There's nothing left, right? The pride's gone now.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the tall trees that are straight, those trees can be manipulated. Those trees can be made to fall in any direction. The lumberjacks that come along to cut the trees down can manipulate the situation to make the tree do exactly what the lumberjack wants it to do. Yet the twisted tree, the weathered tree, can't be made to do anything that the lumberjack wants.
The lumberjacks are afraid of even approaching the tree.
Yeah.
And
One thing that I found interesting was the number of 300, and if you go into Hebrew meanings of numbers, it actually means an appointed time, or victory over death. And also, I don't know if you guys noticed this, but in the very first page, the ponderosa pine is capitalized, so it's the only one that's actually given a name, a proper name. It's capitalized. And then back to what you were saying, Jill, is the arms that are coming off are very significant of priesthood, that the priesthood's being taken away. And if you take the 300 years and also apply it to the 3 covenants that this grove or this forest of trees, the Abrahamic Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, and the Davidic Covenant, could be symbolic of those 3 different covenants that made up that forest that ended when Christ was crucified. And so it ended the people that had access to that. And that's just a few other things. Oh, the other thing is when the trees started falling, that the Lord allowed the wicked to destroy the wicked.
So, Jacqueline, I was thinking the same along those lines, with those branches being family ties and relationships. And of course, that's what priesthood really is, right? Fellowshipping with not only those on earth, so the trees among each other, but then of course those branches being broken off, which could reach to heaven, but they can no longer reach and have that fellowship, that priesthood with heaven, or that fellowship with heaven.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Awesome.
I want to say something.
You're talking.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So talking about the tall and straight trees being cut down, it reminds me of the angel Nephi when he appeared to Joseph Smith in the bedroom, and he said that, and he quoted Malachi, I believe it's Malachi, where he says that the time that that the Gentiles would be cut off, or it hadn't come in yet, but it was coming, that there would be this cutting off. I think it's very interesting that this parable takes place in the Sawtooth Mountains, and the total eclipse that happened in August of 2017, it went directly through the Sawtooth Mountains. That was part of the line of totality. And Denver has said that the next eclipse is going to make the next X over the United States. You know, the first one went this way, the second one's going to go this way. And this X is a sign of a cutting off. And he mentioned that this is the mother's frustration, anger, specifically talking about abortion and the killing of these unborn children. And it just kind of struck me that this parable taking place in the line of totality, this parable being symbolic of the mother and her love for us, the trees being cut down, showing a cutting off that is still yet future, I think is all just really symbolic. And, you know, this parable was written, 2010? When was this? I think he
2008.
2008. He might have written them earlier, but the book was published in 2008. And I don't know if the significance of the eclipses had even dawned on Denver, but I think we can look and see some significance in the parable relating to that prophecy that he's talked about.
And that cutting off of both root and branch, it specifically goes to some lengths to point out that when they would fell a tree, then they would quickly cut off all the branches. It had been cut off root, cut off branch, which is, he's mentioned that that's a genealogical sort of thing, meaning cut off out of the family of God and left without a tie or a relationship. So the fact that he included that, I think, is significant, root and branch.
Yeah, absolutely. That detail, and then also back to what Tasha said, you know, the mother's ire being demonstrated by the eclipses going across the United States.
Tasha?
It seems very obvious that this, you know, the weather tree could certainly be very symbolic of the mother. And it reminds me of what Denver said, where, you know, if you imagine that Heavenly Mother is this soft-spoken, very, you know, round around the edges, lovely person, then you don't know her. She's pretty fierce. And, you know, going back to this weather tree is scarred and tough, and she's gonna take you to task if she needs to.
Tasha, remind us of the date for this second eclipse, this mother's eclipse.
It's April of 2024.
Right. April 2024. And the first one was August, what was it?
2017.
No, it was the 19th.
It was the 21st.
21st, 2017. Thank you, Jill.
And the intersection looks like it's in Missouri of the X's.
Yep.
It's technically over southwest or southeastern Missouri, but the pinpoint is over Illinois, just east of the Missouri border. So people say, oh, it's over Jackson County, opposite end of the state.
Nice try.
You know, one little thought to piggyback on yours, Tasha, about abortion. You know, Denver's last talk, he talked very strongly about abortion being the downfall of our nation, and the cutting off of the branches of these trees is also perhaps symbolic of the downfall of our nation, where the abortion, you can't produce fruit. If you cut off the branches, they can't bear any fruit. It would be interesting to see with the eclipse if there's two things that are going to bring the downfall of the country. One coming through the sawtooths, represented by this tree, perhaps representing abortion, and the other one, I don't know what that would be, but it's interesting symbolism.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Only too late did the forest realize the weathered tree alone would survive. Some of the last to fall called out to her and said, "We are sorry. Please forgive us for how we treated you. I shall always remember your beauty and never recall anything which would diminish the memory of you all," she called back. She meant this and felt great sorrow at the passing of her accusers. Now, if there's something that ultimately points toward the love of God and Christ and the weather tree symbolizing them, I feel like that's one of the biggest things. You know, the reaction of this tree who has been mocked and disrespected and had the hardest life around, immediately she's just filled with sorrow that these other trees are falling. She forgives them automatically. You know, it harkens back to Christ on the cross in the middle of the worst thing being done to them, asking the Father to forgive them because they didn't know what they were doing. When the harvest ended, the weathered tree looked down upon the fertile ground below, where only the stumps of the forest remained. It was now a solitary scene. The lone tree missed its beautiful companions. While they had been unable to see themselves, she had been able to see them all. They had indeed been beautiful. Perhaps she had been the subject of their scorn because she was all they could see. Maybe, if they could have seen themselves as I saw them, she thought, they would have felt more joy. Maybe they never realized their own beauty. Had they seen themselves as I saw them, I believe they would have been happier. And there's another demonstration of, you know, the way the Lord sees us all and the extraordinary grace that he offers to everyone and just sees the best in us all the time.
Hey, I wanted to add something to that.
Yep.
If you compare last week's axis and this week the withered tree, you'll notice some obvious things. Last week it was Christ, of course, covered in scars but untamed. Here we have the withered tree covered in scars, but see how she reacts when this harvesting takes place. It's with forgiveness. She's still got the scars. She still suffered through these battles. But her reaction to seeing her children harvested, it shocks her. It says, and she's like, it takes her almost by surprise. So I just thought it was kind of interesting to look at the two places of a divine male and a divine female. That's the way I look at these two parables.
Yeah.
And everything that made Axis unwanted and vile to look upon is the very thing that sets this tree apart, that makes her have become who she was. And I also found a lot of interesting parallel between last week's Axis and this week.
And it kind of makes you think, makes you wonder, you know, you talk about, we hear about Christ being the lamb and the lion. The lion because of his obvious power and knowledge, but the lamb, as I thought about these two parables, represented in both of them, the lamb side of them is they've experienced so much, they've seen everything, they know your pain, they're not quick to judge because they've been there, they've done that, they've seen it from every angle, so they're slow to react in a harsh way, but yet the power is obvious. So you kind of it made me look at Christ and Heavenly Mother a little different, in that they were, for me personally, I was able to approach them in prayer after really considering these things last week with a little different perspective. These are two individuals who have been through a lot. They get it. They know.
Yeah.
I'm drawn to the Lord wanting us to learn to see one another like he sees us, with generosity and grace and patience, and looking beyond all the nonsense that are just part of the trappings of mortality.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so easy to want to look good, to look righteous, to look well put together. But, you know, Christ is up there like, I see what's going on inside, and that's okay. It's okay to be broken. It's okay to have scars. It's okay to be at your wit's end. It's that's what makes us strong.
Oops.
Go ahead.
Taking that Christ and Heavenly Mother symbolism a little further, this paragraph to me is the central, central aspect of the whole parable, because it's how they see us, and then this line. So they love us. They no matter who we are, what we do. There's, like someone else mentioned, the grace and the Kevin mentioned the generosity that they have towards us with their love and grace. What struck me about this line here, perhaps she had been the subject of their scorn because she was all they could see. Like that. I'm not sure what you all think about that, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. She was all they could see, so we don't really know ourselves as nearly as much as God knows us, as Christ knows us. But are we? What does that mean? I mean, what does it mean that she was all they could see?
Phil, to me, it's when we look around at life, it's pretty easy for us to find all kinds of ways to blame God for our circumstances, to blame the negative that we experience, that we see in others, the hurt that we receive from others, or even disconnected. The babies that are starving, or the unborn children who are killed. It's really popular to look at all of the what we deem as terrible things and blame God for it all. And to me, this is a very clear image of that. When you're looking up to blame somebody, you're going to look up at the tree and you're going to scorn the tree, and it's all, how dare you do this? We don't have the perspective to realize that even those unborn babies or starving children, all of us who suffer so much, we are benefiting, we're gaining experience, not necessarily from being here, but from being separated from God for even a short moment, that there is enough to gain that it makes it worthwhile. We don't have that perspective. And with that, we look up at the tree, and it's easy to only see the negative and to only blame without understanding the reverse perspective at how much growth there is from the position we find ourselves.
Okay. Moving on. The men never leave a cut forest without planting seedlings. Therefore, they returned and restocked the barren ground with new replacement life. However, seedlings raised by men are unprepared to survive without care. And in this valley, there was no one to care for them. The hungry deer who still remained ate most of the seedlings. The remainder struggled and died, disoriented on the floor of the valley. For a time, it seemed the valley was destined never to become a forest again. Okay. Who are these seedlings? Any thoughts?
I think the barren and the fertile ground gives us a clue. You notice it was called right above in the second paragraph down. She looked down upon the fertile ground where the stumps were, but you get down into that one and it's now called a barren ground. So that's covenantal. Well,
I think that the seeds that she cast down would have to be people that she sends down on earth to teach, because without God's word, just like the forest that had grown before, perfect and tall, but it said was left, it didn't have, it was left by men to tend. God has to be available there, his word for us, in order for a forest to grow that will actually bear seed. So I think it's the Elohim sent, messenger sent to teach so that the forest can bear fruit.
I think that's probably true of the seeds that she sent down. But before that, the seedlings that the lumber company planted and that were ate and that died, my thought on that was kind of the Christian Reformation, where they knew there was something wrong and they tried to fix what was broken, but because the seeds planted during that time were raised by men and left without care, then those things eventually died or went corrupt or whatnot. Anyone else have a better idea of what those floundering seedlings that didn't survive might be?
I like the idea of the juxtaposition of the labors of men versus the labors of God. The idea that, and this is something that's really stuck with me recently, is that the Lord will bring again Zion. So if we're thinking in terms of Zion, it's the Lord's work, and we get to participate in it and do it his way, but the labors of men are frustrated. The works of men are frustrated, whereas the labor of God is prosperous. So the condition of the soil matters, but I think the origin of the labor is essential. So the Christian Reformation makes a ton of sense because that was the work of men, whereas the seedlings that grow from the weathered tree, that's the work of the gods.
Well, and he says that those seedlings were unprepared, so they lacked the foundation necessary to survive.
Yeah. How many times are we unprepared?
Killer deer is an interesting thought. They have such pretty eyes. Who would think of them as the killer deer?
It's the deer that's going to kill us.
So in an actual forest, there's multiple cycles. They'll harvest the trees and then they'll plant seedlings, and they do grow up and they do become a new forest, and then they harvest them again, and it's a cyclic thing. But in this story, there's one harvest and the seedlings don't survive. That's not real life situation. So to me, what I see in this, and there's not one right answer, but Adrian's comment about being destroyed root and branch, and somebody else made that on the chat, and Tasha's comment about being cut off from among the people, and Jacqueline's comment about this is covenant language, suggests to me that this is the end of the covenant, the cutting off that comes in the near future, when Christian ministers will come and say, hey, we want baptism now, and the Spirit will be impressed by the Spirit to not offer it. Why? Because they have been cut off from among the people, and at that point, she will gather her chicks under her wing, and that will become the family of God, and those will eventually be the only ones who survive, because Zion will expand and eventually include North and South America and all the world. To me, this is a prophetic end times thing, and I think that's what the three of you are getting at, but we're smart enough not to say.
Well, that is an interesting point is that the idea of these seedlings being raised by men and not surviving is kind of a fabrication and not what happens in real life. So what does that really mean for us when the harvest comes and when we try to replant without the Lord's help? It will inevitably come to naught.
Well, the comment about a natural cycle and, Kevin's little jab about killer deer, that's not the first mention of deer in the parable. The prior mention of deer talks about how the forest enjoyed the pleasantries. It was normal and natural and enjoyable for the deer to come around and eat. It wasn't destructive completely at that point.
Well, and it even laments that the weathered tree didn't have any deer to come and enjoy her shade.
Yeah. The deer didn't change. The deer are the deer. What changed is the circumstances, the natural progression of things being out of order.
Yeah, and I'm learning about permaculture because at the end of Denver's last talk, he said you got to learn some skills. So and in a true forest, you've got these massive trees and you've got these various canopy layers and you've got small seedlings coming up and there's kind of this harmony. The deer poop in the woods and it fertilizes the seedlings. And when you go in and just kind of whole scale take out an entire forest of trees, you do tremendous damage. And for that to rebuild and regrow, it's not going to be an act of man, it's going to be an act of God. So deforestation is a real destructive thing. And so, not to go down an environmentalist path here, but I think that there's a principle here that God has set up natural laws, certain spiritual laws by which growth and progression happen. And when we try and do it a different way or violate those principles, there's destruction that happens.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind with this whole thing. The weather tree could very much also be a demonstration of Mother Earth. The earth looks upon what's happening on her face and is just so saddened by the destruction that happens, and yet loves us still, even though we mistreat her by the way that we disrespect the earth and the environment.
I also found too that perhaps it could represent the end time, the judgment of man, and creating a new cycle again, where this time she sends down the Elohim to be those, the family of God, to teach and prepare the world. I found that, that perhaps it could also represent the final judgment and the cyclical world without end.
While that got mentioned a moment ago about the deer and how the trees, down in the valley, they could enjoy their pleasantries. And if you catch the play on words about pleasant trees, you're back to the Garden of Eden, where you can read that God created it, yea, even all things which I prepared for the use of man, and man saw that it was good for food. And I, the Lord God, planted the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and also the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it goes on and talks about how he caused to grow every tree naturally that is pleasant to the sight of man, and man could behold it. Likewise, when Eve is persuaded to partake in the parable in the garden, she sees the tree that it is pleasant. And so I'm not going to overlay any meaning into that other than to point out that seems to be a delightful little play on words that was snuck in there.
And I was going towards that Garden of Eden concept too. I guess one of the last podcasts that was posted, Denver says something about having the capacity to see things in their correctly ordered fashion, similarly to how God originally intended that it would be ordered, so that you are no longer out of sync with this creation and doing your best to reign with blood and horror, by subduing nature with the iron plow and gunpowder and lead, but instead you find yourself situated in a place that Eden itself can be renewed and harmony can be achieved between man and the earth.
Yep.
Reference to cycles reminds me of something my dad told me once. He had buddies who worked for the Forest Service. And he said the reason they always went out to plant seedlings after a cut was because pine trees typically will produce seeds only once every about 3 years, and the precipitation for them to germinate comes along once only about every 7 years. So statistically, perhaps once every 21 years, you might get a crop of new seeds. And it's just interesting that, you know, the ways of the Lord are simply not our ways. Whatever he is planting is going to work from his perspective. Whatever humans attempt may or may not work.
Very true. All right. The weather tree looked down on these as these events unfolded before her. Then she took heart. Her despair turned to hope as she shed her pine cones off the cliff to bounce to the ground below. From her height, the drop would send her seeds bouncing to even the farthest reach of the valley below. Unlike the seedlings planted by men, these seeds were from a parent whose life was difficult and whose daily struggle had tempered her with a resolve unlike the life force of any domestic plant. These seeds bore in them the determination of a strong parent. They sprouted and grew full of life and vigor. So I love this comparison of the domestic plant and the wild plant planted by the Lord, essentially. It reminds me of John the Baptist, you know, the wild man out in the forest. He was clearly not a domestic plant. And I was wondering, how do you guys see yourselves? Do you think you grow up as more a domestic plant or as more of a wild plant? Do you think you've changed over the years and become more wild or become more tame?
I don't know if I have a response to that, but I had a question for Dr. Red. When you read that, Phil, did you think of epigenetics? Epigenetics being the stresses and experiences of one generation may form the genetic expression of following generation.
Kevin, I try to leave work at work.
Oh, you're a wise man,
No, I think that's really interesting, Kevin.
Could we be the offspring of Axis and those like him? Could we have scarred, tested, powerful parentage?
Well, I want to take it back to what I don't know what the gentleman's name who was talking about the deforestation.
Peter.
Peter?
Yeah, Peter.
Is that? Oh, okay. Hi, Peter. I guess I kind of think about what you were saying before, where this, you know, the work of man versus the work of God, and we tend to, you know, as scientists, as a doctor, we like to think that science has an explanation for everything, and the more I learn about science, the more I think we're farther from having an answer for everything than we have been. And it's, you know, if we can think, if we were able to understand things as God understands them, just like this paragraph where it says, unlike the seedlings planted by men, these seeds were from a parent whose life was difficult and whose daily struggle had tempered her with a resolve unlike the life force of any domestic plant. Well, if you think about Annette's comment that this was the Elohim being sent down from heavenly, you know, our heavenly parents, there's certainly a difference there. There's something, there's merit in the struggle. There's merit in the not trying to simplify everything in a way that we can understand it. We have to reach farther. We have to reach higher. We have to reach deeper, just like Joseph Smith said we need to search the highest heavens and the darkest abyss to find truth. We cannot simplify the ways of God. There's just no way we can do that. So I guess in answer to your question, Kevin, no, it didn't come to mind. Epigenetics didn't come to mind. But as we sit and talk about what this might represent, we have heavenly parents who love us. We have a Savior and his consort who did everything in their power, who pushed against everything that could have gone wrong to save us. And in the end, are we going to look up to them? Are we going to look up and plead with them to forgive us? Or are we going to follow their examples?
And with that, there is struggle that must come with rising up to know God and to become saved, to become a member of their family. It requires that we be buffeted against the wind and that we reach our arms up and that we toil and struggle and be lonely and face those adversities so that we become stronger, so that we can become like them, so that we can become their seed and likewise do what they have done. And so I think that if we are going to recognize who we potentially can be, we can, we have a choice, I guess. We can be the forest trees that are tall and straight and uniform and not unique and don't have to struggle and toil, or we can rise up to become like our heavenly parents and ultimately become their offspring, and perhaps in a new round return with a new mission as an offspring of God.
Very good. Actually, that's an excellent lead in into the rest of this. Someone? No? Okay. Months turned to years, and a small forest grew again below. As the forest grew, the weather tree watched with joy her family increase. This new forest, unlike the old, knew they were indebted to the weather tree. They knew she was their mother. Where before the forest had mocked her, this new one prized her. They knew from her height she could see farther than any of them below. Tell us of the coming clouds, they would ask, and she would warn them of things to come before they arrived. The forest grew in height and beauty, and the weather tree counseled and taught them as they did. She told them of their beauty. She told them how they looked from above. Although they could not see themselves as she did, they understood who they were because of her. They called her our great mother, and she called them children. The weather tree remains there today. She is crooked, windswept, scarred, and standing alone on a granite cliff. But her life's sufferings and her many injuries have made her wise, and her children regard her as the greatest beauty in the forest. It does not matter she stands alone, for she lives in harmony with her family. Because of them, she is never alone. Because of her, they are never without hope. Okay, so they called her our great mother, and she called them children. And looking at there are 10 parables and there's 10 talks, and so I was like, well, what's the 5th talk about, since this is the 5th parable? And the 5th talk is all about priesthood. And I was like, yep. So from that talk, they become the sons of Moses and of Aaron and the seed of Abraham and the church and kingdom and the elect of God. So they become, but they become as a consequence of having been sanctified. They become sanctified because they magnify their calling. They had to first obtain the priesthood, and the obtaining of the priesthood requires something that is faithful. And you ask yourself, faithful to what? And always it is faithful to him, to our Lord, the one who redeems. All of these things flow together as one continuum. The way that we rise up and obtain the priesthood is through knowing God, through knowing who he is. If we can come to a place where we recognize our great mother and our great father, and where they can actually claim us as their children, then we are full participants in the priesthood. Okay. Ready, go. Thoughts. We've reached the end. What have you been wanting to say that you haven't yet?
Whoops.
Go ahead, Marcia.
Okay. As you read that last little bit, it just hit me, which it hasn't before, that it made me think of the Sarah Lawrence in C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. She is in the afterworld. She's this great lady, and she was essentially what we would think of as a nobody in her earthly life. But she fed the cats, or so I can't remember what it is. But I mean, she just did the things that needed to be done that were right in front of her, and she is this great lady in the next life. That's the way that tree makes me think.
Yeah.
These last few paragraphs, the Zion imagery really hits home to me. It talks about how the forest now knows that she is the mother. Well, in Zion, we will have the temple, which will teach us who we are and who our heavenly parents are. It says that from this height, she could see farther and warn them, tell them of coming clouds, and things before they arrived, which makes me think of Zion up on the hill, or even the weathered mother tree up on the hill, protecting her seed below in Zion, where we'll be protected from all the trials and tribulations that are coming. Anyway, it just goes on talking about how they finally understood who they were more, they understood who she was. That type of knowledge seems to come with the temple. Zion is also feminine in nature, so I really see a dual symbolism here of the mother, of Zion, of protection, of the temple.
Yeah, the gathering, the hen gathering is a feminine endeavor as well.
And I really like comparing the two types of communication that go on between the valley and the mountain. You know, originally, the only reason they looked up, you know, was to mock and to scorn. But this new crop, they are really trying to communicate, to learn. And I think that's the lesson to me from all of this, is I need to seek intelligence from heaven. I need to seek truth and be humble and be able to receive in order to grow. So I really like those two different types of communication.
Yeah. Well, and the difference that it makes, those who grow up knowing their mother or their God, it gives them strength, and it completely changes how they grow up, even though they're growing tall and straight, probably just like the other ones. Simply knowing who their parent is makes all the difference.
One of the thoughts that, go ahead.
The promise that everyone will know the Lord at some point connects with this passage to me. At some point, it will be so clear, it'll be so beautiful. We will be so motivated to be like him, be like her, and treat everybody else as close to that as possible.
Yeah. So one of the thoughts that I had is this a second forest grew up straight and tall in height as well, similar to the first forest. But I think the difference is because they didn't have their language or their mind, their language confounded, or the mists of darkness over their minds, thinking that they were on the straight and narrow path. They became lofty, and which caused them to gain the disfavor of heaven, where this particular forest also grew in height, but because of taking the wise counsel of the mother under the shadow of the granite rock, which I see as the male figure. So the heavenly parents are the ones at the head, teaching and counseling, that they were kept in check by their love for the parents that were the grand counselors that stood above them. And then as you were asking the question is, how do you see yourself in this? It cites my mind to the difference between a Marian society, or the Society of Rome. Because Rome is more of a xenophobic society where they're very narrow in their range of what they think is acceptable. They promote competition. Constantine is a great example of that, where he used councils and creeds. And where in the Marian society, it's all about cooperation, and they look to harness the talents of those around them, which takes you back to the society that brought about the Renaissance. And so with those thoughts in mind, probably the most startling sentence in this entire parable is the first sentence in the last paragraph. So anyway, thanks for letting me share my thoughts.
Thank you. And so I asked on the Covenant chat specifically how to think about how you see yourselves in the weathered tree, in the tall and straight trees, in the people that cut down the tree, and then in the trees that grew from the mother's seedlings. And anyone have any good thoughts about that?
Can I mention a word about the soil?
Yes.
So the tree lives in the most difficult spot of all the forest. Too little soil there, too little water, and so on. And we alluded earlier, it was mentioned, of course, the parable of the vineyard, Jacob chapter 3. Something I'll point out is that both olive trees, which are the subject of that parable, and grapes, which make up a vineyard and which make wine, the symbol of the Lord's blood, both of those require terrible soil. They require bad circumstances to grow and to bear fruit. And so the fact that this tree grew in the worst spot of ground and yet ultimately bore the most fruit ought not to be lost on us.
Yeah, I think it hits over and over and over the last paragraph parable with Axis, and then this entire parable. It's very clear that
the Lord coming out of Galilee, which was considered the backwater, worst place. Denver coming out of Mountain Hole, for good grief.
Mountain Home.
Home. Sorry. I get confused with what it gets called in Idaho. Anyway, the idea that, always coming out of this poor spot of ground, it makes you wonder about where Zion will be planted. And people will say, oh, there's no way. There's not enough soil up there. Oh, it's too windswept. It's too cold, and so on.
Yeah.
Am I the only one that wonders how the weathered tree was planted there to begin with?
I mean, non-allegorically, it would have been an act of nature, where a seed blows in there, good seed, and is able to survive alone, have enough root to draw what a little nourishment they can from the granite and from the surroundings. So as far as in the big picture, how would the Divine Mother, where did she come from? I mean, that's a brilliant question, Someone put her there.
Yeah. Well, and I love how obvious it is with the Axis parable and then this one, that experience is good and hard stuff is good and messing up is good, and we need the crap soil if we're going to really grow up strong and make something of ourselves, because the sheltered trees were weak, and the fall of their falling from their proud state was quite an event, and we need to be sure that we don't resent the Lord for the struggles that he gives us, and instead try to make the most of it.
Jared has a hand up.
Jared.
Yeah, I guess since we're winding up some thoughts, I skipped over while you're discussing it. I guess along those same lines, the thing that struck me is when the Lord is talking to Joseph, and the greatness, as he puts it, is in his descending below them all. As he says, I've descended below them all, are they're greater than he. And it's that descent, like it's like how much crap can you take is really the measure of how great something is. And that's an interesting standard to be able to take, that like at least the Lord measuring his own greatness, it's not by being isolated from adversity, but by being able to handle the absolute worst of all forms of adversity that can be thrown there. And anyway, philosophically, just the ideas about God and the world of being some distant being who's only great, perhaps because he doesn't have to experience all the junk that we have here, is perhaps completely inverted, that greatness really is in being able to endure so much that's what really puts it in perspective. One side one, just when you were discussing the eclipse things, and if one represented the abortion, I guess, just a thought I had on that perhaps might be, and I guess associating that with perhaps a female responsibility. The thing in my mind is, if there was something to the other eclipse, I'd probably pick it to be war. As a nation especially, we've been very war prone, and having entered into basically endless war recently, and I don't know.
Yeah, that was my exact thought, was war. It's the masculine equivalent of that sin.
No, Annette, you asked where we see ourselves in which aspect of these, the forest and the solitary tree. And as I was reading this parable, I did see myself in the forest. I grew up very devout LDS, returned missionary. I did everything right. I did everything everybody else did. Everybody in our family, with the exception of one person, went to BYU. We were all returned missionaries. We all got married in the temple. We all did everything uniformly and unique, not unique, but without any variation, and did everything right until we stumbled upon more truth and had the willingness to think outside the box and to look upward and to perhaps see things differently. And at that point, the buffetings began. I even went so far as to think my life was relatively easy. And I was just sliding right by, because I already had my eternal family, 6 children, did it all right. And I just had to endure to the end. And it wasn't even that hard, because I was just, skating along. And I even remember the times when I thought that boy, this being a Mormon is not hard at all. And then I woke up and things changed, and the buffetings began, and the trials really began. And I did find myself very alone. And the day we walked out of our 4.5-hour excommunication council and left that room of 15 men and walked into the state, past that threshold into the state president's office, I suddenly found myself very naked, exposed, alone, just me and God. I felt like the whole world was watching me. And it was a very scary feeling, a very scary place to be. I felt very judged and very torn, yet closer to God. And through that, the only way to gain that knowledge and to gain that relationship with him was to go through those buffetings, and they continue. They're not going to go away. But I have found myself in various stages of my life in the various places within the forest, and find myself somewhat weathered like the mother tree.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I know when I was thinking through things, I considered the lumber company that came in to cut everything down, and they were just doing their job. They're just doing their job, and they came in and they did what they were supposed to do, and there was no reason for them to apologize. And I wonder how many times I go about my life like that, where I'm just doing what I need to do. I'm just living my life, doing my thing, and I don't realize that I might be standing at the base of someone's tree and taking them down and hurting the people around them because I'm not cognizant of those around me. Anyone else? Or should we wrap it up?
I just wanted to thank whoever, was it Cameron, were you and Annette the ones that organized these Zoom talks on the 10 parables?
It was him.
It was him. I think this is awesome because for those of us that are newer to the movement, this is a great way to get to put faces with names and to kind of have our hearts knit together as we learn doctrine together and hear people's stories. Thanks for sharing, Sherry-Ann. I could relate. So thanks so much, guys.
Well, thank you. I haven't ever met you before, Peter, I don't think, but it's wonderful hearing your voice and seeing you and meeting this way. I hope everyone is uplifted from participation in this, even those who aren't able to join in person but can watch the recordings later.
Yeah, this is cool.
Wonderful.
Sounds like we'll wrap it up here then, yeah?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Yeah, I love the comments, and thank you for preparing and leading the discussion, love.